Hi, Govan, and welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the difference between the book and the movie when it comes to Gandalf's disappearance because of his imprisonment at Isengard. Normally when I do these book versus movie comparisons, I'm comparing and contrasting the actual substance of the story, but here that's not really the case because the basic story is the same. There's maybe a few small differences in terms of, what characters say and do, but nothing really major is different between the two. The real difference here is how the story is presented, and it's a really interesting look into how you tell stories differently for books and for movies. And also, it's an interesting look at how Tolkien in particular likes to tell his stories, because Tolkien, even as a book writer, is different than most other authors in terms of how he likes to order and present the story that he's telling. So let's take a look at how the movie and the book tell the same story in very different ways, but for, both for legitimate purposes. The first key point here, and this is the biggest difference by far, of course, is simply the fact that in the book, we don't know anything about where Gandalf is or what's going on until at least when Strider and the hobbits get close to Weathertop. And it's at that point that they see, flashes of light on the hilltop, and then they actually get to Weathertop, and they end up finding a stone with a G rune and 3 scratches, which Strider interprets with, no absolute certainty, as meaning that Gandalf was there on October the 3rd. Now, up to this point, of course, Frodo and the other hobbits have had no idea where Gandalf is, why he's delayed, what in the world is going on. And this has been a major point of concern for them. And it's even a concern for Strider, too, because Strider tells them at the Prancing Pony that he has never really known Gandalf to be late like this, and he's worried about him really for the first time ever. And so when they see this at Weathertop, this is like their first clue that Gandalf is even alive. The other major difference, of course, is that we know nothing about why Gandalf has been absent, and we don't know for sure that he is even still alive, because G3 could mean a lot of things, until they reach Rivendell and Frodo wakes up, and there's Gandalf sitting there in his room, telling him that it's 10 o'clock in the morning. So this is the key difference between the two, and it's the fact that there is a total lack of knowledge in the one versus in the movie we get, cut scenes from every now and then we're following the hobbits, but every now and then we get a look at what Gandalf is doing, and so we know where Gandalf is and why he hasn't shown up to be with the hobbits. The tricky thing is, why do you make this change and how does it affect the story? So in the book, of course, as I mentioned, Gandalf's disappearance is a major point of concern. And it's also a major point of concern in the movie because when they get to Bree, this is where Gandalf in the movie told Frodo that he would meet him. Because Gandalf in the movie actually tells Frodo, I'm going to visit Saruman, the head of my order, and I will meet you at Bree. This is one of the few small changes that is actually a change in the story itself. Because in the book what happens is Gandalf tells Frodo, I'm going to, go out of the borders of the Shire to try to gather some news because I've been sitting here for too long. Because at that point he had been with Frodo for a few weeks, if I remember correctly, and hadn't been able to gather any news or anything. He's basically just kind of hiding out at Bag End, trying to keep a low profile because of all the other hobbits who think he's a disturber of the peace and not too keen on him being around. And so he tells Frodo, I'm going to go gather some news. And he tells him, I'll definitely be back before your birthday when you just, leave to set out for Crick Hollow and then ultimately leave the Shire. Which, of course, this is also a little bit of a difference between the book and the movie, because in the movie it's all very sudden. It's like, you've got to leave now, Frodo. Let's get it. We've got to get you out of here. Whereas in the book, there's a lot more planning and delay and things that go around. So Gandalf says, I'm going to go gather some news. And this happens in April, okay? Or maybe around early May. But at any rate, in April, he sets out, and then, or, well, actually, I think April might have been right before, but it's certainly before midsummer. And in midsummer, or very near to midsummer, he's out doing his news gathering, and who finds him but Radagast the Brown? And Radagast the Brown tells him, oh, you need to go see Saruman. He's looking for you, and he told me that I could find you in this region called the Shire. And it's only because of this that in the book, Gandalf decides to go to visit Isengard and see Saruman. So at this point, he's still got plenty of time to go do that and then come back in time for Frodo's departure from the Shire, from Bag End, to go towards Crick Hollow and ultimately to Rivendell. But he's got a horse and, some of these other things. Like, the trip to Isengard is not an especially long one. The company make it most of the way there on foot in about, a few weeks in the book. And on horse, you could make it a lot farther, a lot faster. And before midsummer, going from there till at least September 22nd, that's 3 months to ride there, do something, talk to Saruman, maybe for a couple days even, and ride back. Still plenty of time to get back. So, even though this is an unexpected, detour for Gandalf, he still has plenty of time to keep his word to Frodo. So, Frodo is, doing his thing, getting ready to depart, planning his moves and all this other stuff. And when the day approaches, he's starting to get worried because he figured, Gandalf would probably be back before. And then Gandalf doesn't show up even on the day of when he's supposed to leave, and he's, really worried about this. So this is a thing that is a really big deal. Whereas in the movie, what we get is Gandalf tells him, you gotta leave now. I'm going to go visit Saruman, and I'll meet you at Bree. So one of the big differences in terms of the actual plot is that Frodo isn't worried about Gandalf in the movie until he gets to Bree and Gandalf is not there. Whereas, the plan was never for Gandalf to meet Frodo and Bree in the book. It was for him to come back to the Bag End and then leave with Frodo in the book. So that's one key difference. But this is like the biggest difference by far in terms of the actual facts of the story. And the real difference comes more in our complete lack of knowledge in the book as opposed to the movie. Because in the movie, we start seeing what Gandalf is doing very early on. I mean, almost as soon as Frodo gets off to his start and, going through the Shire and walking around, we get a scene where Gandalf visits Saruman, and then very quickly it devolves and Saruman outs himself as a bad guy and ends up taking Gandalf captive. And so we know this in the movie very early. In the book, of course, we don't know anything. And we are basically in the same boat as Frodo, wondering, where is Gandalf? Why hasn't he shown up? And then, to top all this off, of course, another difference between the book and the movie is that in the book, Frodo doesn't really know, a whole lot about the Black Riders, and neither does he in the movie. But there is a substantial difference in terms of how they are introduced to us, because in the movie, we, kind of get this scene of them riding out of Minas Morgul, and then we see them a few more times before they ever catch up to Frodo, because we're getting, and this is kind of similar to the effect that the movie way of telling this has. It's doing kind of the same thing with the Black Riders. It is giving us information up front to increase our anxiety level about Frodo's safety. We don't get that with Frodo in the book until we actually have the Black Rider catch up to him, and the hobbits get off to the side of the road. The Black Rider comes up, stops exactly where they were, and starts sniffing around, and literally sniffing around as far as Frodo can tell. And as a result of this, Frodo is now worried because he's like, that wasn't a hobbit. That was like one of the big people, much too big to be a hobbit. And it looks like he's searching for me, which is kind of worrisome. Now, of course, Frodo knows that he is going to be hunted because he has the ring. He didn't expect it this early. Frodo in the movie is in a slightly different position because he also doesn't really expect anything to happen in the Shire, but he's also kind of been told by Gandalf, you need to hurry up and get out of here. Whereas Frodo in the book is taking a much more leisurely pace. He's not really worried about moving too awful fast. Partially because he doesn't want to alert anybody to the fact that he's leaving. He wants it to be more of a, I'm moving to Crick Hollow, it's all good, nothing's really happening here, and then sneak off very quietly. This is another somewhat major difference between the two, but when we first see the Black Rider in the book and when we first see the Black Rider in the movie, it's a very different thing, because in the book, Frodo has just like this bad feeling and suddenly decides, hey, let's get off the road, and he kind of tries to explain it away by saying he doesn't want to be seen, and if it is Gandalf, they can surprise him to kind of get him back for being late. Whereas in the movie, we get the scene where he has this, telescoping vision thing going on, and he's all of a sudden, get off the road, quick! Like he knows something bad is going to happen, and, then we get the scene with them hiding under the tree roots, and, we get the very clear idea that this is bad news. Especially the way that scene is done, all the bugs and things start crawling out of the earth and doing what they do. But the first time this happens in the book, they don't ever get anywhere near the Black Rider. It looks like it might have kind of figured out where they stopped, but doesn't do much. It's only after 2 or 3 more, run-ins with these Black Rider figures that they're really like, this is really getting kind of creepy. And of course, they get 2 instances of this before they meet with Gildor in the book, and then they get a third after Gildor, because they wake up and they start down and then they see a Black Rider kind of back where they came from, not actually near them, but seemingly on their trail. And then, of course, they see a Black Rider at the Buckleberry Ferry. But at no point in the book is there like a high-stakes, high-speed chase. Whereas in the movie, that's pretty much what we have from, start. When they run into the Black Rider the first time, Sam throws, or I think it's Sam anyway, but one of the hobbits throws something to distract the Black Rider and make him think that he's over there, and then they all set off running. And the next thing you know, we're seeing all 4 hobbits just running through the woods, panting like they've been running all day, and then, trying to figure out what they can do next. And then the Black Rider, ambushes them right where they are. And so the tension in the book and the movie is just a very different thing at this point, because in the book, it's a lot of very slow build creepiness. Whereas in the movie, we're talking about more of a high adrenaline, run for your life scenario. And this is emblematic of the way that the 2 are done, because next thing you know, in the movie, the hobbits are at Bree looking around like they still expect to be caught up by a Black Rider any minute. And they get into Bree, get to the Prancing Pony, and they're like, okay, we can meet Gandalf and we're going to be fine. And then Gandalf's not there. Whereas by the time they get to Bree in the book, what they're hoping is that Gandalf has, maybe tried to catch up to them and gone by the main road and gotten ahead of them to Bree or wherever, and that they will meet up with Gandalf, but they don't have really any clue where Gandalf is. Their hope that they're going to run into Gandalf is really based on just, he was late, but I'm hoping he ain't dead, and maybe he shows up, because we got delayed in the old forest, and that gives him a chance to catch up with us. It's not founded on any necessary expectation that Gandalf is going to be in the Prancing Pony or anywhere else specific for that matter. Because the whole plan in the book was Gandalf was going to come back before they ever left Bag End and be with them, be with Frodo the whole time. So, the tension in the book is a very different kind of tension than what's in the movie. Because in the movie, up until Bree, we don't have the fear that Frodo has of, where's Gandalf? What's going on with Gandalf? We don't know what's going on with Gandalf. Our anxiety in terms of Gandalf is, we know he's been captured. Is he going to get out? What's going to happen to him? And our anxiety with Frodo is, oh man, he's being chased. Is he going to make it? Is he going to get caught? Whereas in the book, both of these tensions are very different. In the book, the tension with Gandalf, as I said, is like, where is he? What's even going on? We don't have any clue where Gandalf is. Why is he late? And the tension with the Black Riders is kind of the same because he's trying to stay away from them, but it's never a high adrenaline, rush type situation where it's like, oh, we got to run away now because they're right on our heels or they may be around any corner. It's like kind of more of a cat and mouse game of, we're just going to stay off the road so it's not easy to find us, and we're going to try to make it to Buckleberry Ferry as quietly and stealthily as we possibly can, and set off immediately. At least that's Frodo's plan. He's like, I'm going to set off immediately. I'm not going to spend any time in Buckland at all. So that's the way the tension goes. And then once we get into the Old Forest, of course, this is a major difference between the two in terms of the story as far as Frodo goes. It doesn't really have so much to do with Gandalf's disappearance, except for the fact that for this period where they're in the Old Forest, about the only thing we're thinking of in terms of Gandalf is, maybe he'll catch up now that we've had to slow down. But our anxiety focuses a lot more on Frodo for a long period of time because of the problems he runs into with Old Man Willow, the Barrow Downs, all this other stuff. They get out of that and they make it to Bree, and now we're kind of thinking about Gandalf again because we have a little bit of a breathing space. Frodo can think about, where's Gandalf? We still need to figure out what we're going to do. Into this mix, then, we get Strider. And, of course, Strider is a surprise in both the book and the movie. And in the book, it's a little bit more low-key than in the movie because the movie is having to compress things a little bit to get things moving along so we can actually fit the whole Fellowship of the Ring in a 3.5-hour movie, which is admittedly difficult. Anyway, in the movie, Strider just kind of takes matters into his own hands, and he's just like, grabs Frodo, takes him up to a room, and, basically scares him into, you're coming with me, pal. Whereas in the book, Strider more talks him into it. And, again, this is very much a difference in terms of just the amount of time that you have to tell the story. But again, one of the key points here is in the book, as opposed to the movie, Strider tells them, I'm really concerned about Gandalf. This is very uncharacteristic and I don't like it. In the movie, the only thing we get from Strider is, you can no longer wait for the wizard, Frodo. They're coming. So again, the focus in the movie is a lot more on, at least when we're watching Frodo's story, the focus is a lot more on, you have to hurry, you have to run, the Black Rider's going to get you, let's go, go, go. Whereas in the book, the focus is still very much on, yes, we're running away, but another major concern is, where's Gandalf? What's happened to him? We all are worried about Gandalf because this is not normal. In the movie, we're still getting occasional looks at what is going on, with Gandalf. There's not a whole lot of breaks in between where we see what's happening with him, but we get 2 or 3, at least, as we go along, and we're seeing, scenes where we see the initial scene where he's captured because Saruman beats him at the wizard battle. We see another one where he's on top of Isengard looking down, and then we get an idea what Saruman is doing with all of his orcs and whatnot. And we see him, grab the moth and whisper something to it. And of course, this already gives us a hint in the movie that Gandalf is doing something to affect something. Not clear that it's going to have anything to do with affecting an escape exactly, but it's at least he's either sending a message or something by means of this moth that will help Frodo ultimately. Gotta be, right? Whereas in the book, of course, we know absolutely nothing until we get to Weathertop, or at least near Weathertop. They see a bunch of light from a distance at Weathertop, and at least Strider and Frodo both see it. I think the other hobbits are all asleep. And they have a short conversation about it, and they're both like, what is going on? This is kind of weird, and it's a little concerning. So they get to Weathertop, and they approach it from an angle which will be least seen in the book. In the movie, of course, we don't get any of this. They get to Weathertop. That's it. Again, you have to compress this story, because in the book, it's kind of a long, tedious approach, and Strider tells him it's kind of a long, tedious approach, but the idea is that they are walking along a path which cannot really be seen except from a certain angle. And that angle is from Weathertop itself, and he acknowledges there's a risk that if anybody's already at Weathertop looking out, they'll be able to spot them, but it's like the safest way to approach the hill. So they do that, they get up there, they find there's nobody there, but they find scorch marks at the top as if a battle had happened recently. And then, of course, they find the stone, which is not charred, and it's got the G rune in the 3, and Strider thinks that this is Gandalf. So this is our first time in the book where we're like, okay, Gandalf was apparently alive, and at least as recently as October the 3rd, which would have been very recently. And in fact, it would have, they point this out in the book even, that would have corresponded to when they saw the flashes of light at the hill. Now, of course, by this point in the book, we actually do trust Strider, and so we are inclined to take his word for it, but we also are wondering, it's a G. I mean, like, that could mean a lot of things. We do, of course, already have some indication that Gandalf likes to use a G rune for his name a lot, because he does that with his fireworks. He's done that with other things in the story, so we do have some indication that, yeah, this probably is actually Gandalf telling them, that he was there. But there is still the possibility that it could be a number of other things. It doesn't have to be Gandalf. So we're still not really sure. We're just hopeful that Gandalf was in fact there. But that still leaves in our mind the question, where has he been this whole time? Now, Strider did already hint earlier in the story that, we might meet Gandalf there, because that would be the place that he would want to go to, because it gives you a broad view. It would give him a chance to spot us. But unless we're just really lucky, we're not going to get there at the same time, and unless that happens, we're not going to meet up. So this is kind of up to expectation. Strider is kind of telling them we might expect to find Gandalf there, but he probably not at the same time, and therefore when he finds the G rune, it seems like a confirmation, which heightens our confidence level a little bit in terms of Gandalf having been there at all. It still is, of course, a very tricky thing. And of course, it also means if Gandalf was there on the 3rd and something big happened that caused all these scorch marks and all the light flashing show that they saw on the top of the hill, that night before, then Gandalf apparently was in trouble, and Strider surmises as much. He's basically like, I think he was probably under attack and had to leave in a hurry. Which means he could still end up dead. We don't know. And they know that there's riders out there looking for them, and they could very well be hunting Gandalf at this point. Now we have a different kind of anxiety. We still have a partial anxiety of, we don't know for sure Gandalf was even alive at all, but now that we think he was, we think he's being hounded by the same people who were hounding us, and that causes its own level of anxiety. Of course, after the stabbing on Weathertop, in the movie, we get another view of Gandalf with his, doing his thing up on Isengard. This is where we get, I think, the one where he catches the moth. So these things kind of come a little bit slow to us in terms of when we learn things in the movie. It takes a while, but we do get them. And the whole time we know that Gandalf is alive, because he's basically just been captured by Saruman. Or at least we're pretty sure he's alive, because the only thing we see is him flying up towards the ceiling of the tower, and then it goes black. But there's no reason to think that would have killed him necessarily. And then we see that he is in fact still alive. So we kind of know that he's alive for sure by the time we get after the stabbing at Weathertop. But after the stabbing at Weathertop, now we have another problem. And our anxiety in both the book and the movie focuses a lot more on Frodo, because now Frodo is potentially going to be dead in a very short amount of time. In the movie, it's a lot shorter, because in the book, they actually have a couple more weeks they have to travel to get to Rivendell, whereas in the movie is like maybe a day. It's not really clear. But Arwen meets him up, immediately takes Frodo, and just rides. Whereas in the book, they're taking it slow and easy. Finally meet Glorfindel, and still taking it slow and easy. So the anxiety again shifts mostly to Frodo, but we also know something about Gandalf in the movie that we don't know in the book. And what we know is actually very different, because in the movie, Gandalf seemingly has only escaped, or hasn't even escaped, by the time the Weathertop incident occurs. He's still a captive, apparently. Whereas in the book, he's apparently not a captive, but also being chased by Black Riders. So once Frodo passes out and then we wake up in Rivendell, now the stories converge again to be basically the same. And Gandalf is telling him, you're in the House of Elrond. It's October the 24th. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. And at this point, everything's back to the way it was. The two stories have ceased to diverge, and now we have the resolution of all the anxieties, because Frodo's okay, Gandalf is there, everything's kosher, right? But what's the difference? Because of the way the story was told differently in the two, the resolution is a very different kind of resolution. In the movie, the resolution is, how's Gandalf getting out of this mess? And it's only after he tells Frodo, I'm sorry, Frodo, I was delayed, that we see him kind of have a flashback of how he escaped Isengard, which apparently happened very late and just in time for him to get to Rivendell before Frodo, or around the same time as Frodo even. And on the other hand, in the book, the resolution is, okay, now I know for sure that Gandalf is fine, and that means he wasn't killed by Black Riders, and he probably actually was there at Weathertop, but, we weren't sure about that. So the resolution that occurs is extremely different, because in the book, the resolution we get is, now we have certainty that Gandalf is alive at all. And now we know where he is, of course. That's the same in both. But we still don't know in the book where he was, why he was captive, anything like that. Gandalf really only tells Frodo, I was held prisoner. And then he saves the actual story of how all that happened for the Council of Elrond. So we, along with Frodo, are still at this point in suspense in terms of what happened. All we know now is that Gandalf survived, and now he's here. We still don't know what happened to him, how, why, any of that stuff. In the movie, we get this flashback immediately after, Frodo asks him, why didn't you meet us? And he says he was delayed. And we get this flashback immediately, so we know now everything that Gandalf knows, which is, he was held prisoner, Saruman's a traitor, all this stuff. And the resolution in the movie is very different as a result, because we're no longer in suspense about anything. But our anxiety was never quite the same in the movie either, because the anxiety in the movie was, we know he's being held prisoner. Is he going to get out? How's he going to get out? Is he going to make it, in time to save Frodo or whatever? And so when he shows up and he's there at Rivendell when Frodo wakes in his room, the resolution is a very different kind of resolution. It's just not the same thing. The key is both of these fit their own storytelling modes very well. And, the telling of the story in the book is very different than the telling of the story in the movie, because in the movie, if you think about it, you can't really do it as well doing it the way that Tolkien does in the book, because if you wait and give none of the information all the way up until Rivendell, and then you wait for the Council of Elrond for Gandalf to really tell the story at all, the Council of Elrond is famous for being a long, fact-filled chapter of information dump, right? And I love the chapter because of its information dump quality. But the fact remains, if you try to do that in a movie, it doesn't work as well. Because in a movie, you can't really afford to halt the action for 30 minutes to an hour to fill in everybody on stuff that happened way long ago. Occasionally you need exposition dumps, but you want to keep them short and you want to keep the action moving. If we make the Council of Elrond one big, huge, long exposition dump in the movie, it doesn't fit the medium. Movies have to be short by their nature because, if you're going to a movie theater to see a movie, you're not wanting to sit there for 30 minutes to an hour while Elrond and Gandalf explain all the nuances of the ring and Gandalf tells how he got captured and how Saruman's a traitor and, you can't do it in a movie. It just doesn't work. So in the movie, we need a resolution that is different than the book because of the time constraints. And this is why I think Peter Jackson chose to have some of those occasional flashes to Gandalf's experience in Isengard, showing us that yes, he's alive, but he's captured, because that gives us, the audience, an anxiety about Gandalf that we can have a resolution for when he shows up miraculously in Rivendell, and then we have that explained in his final flashback, but it doesn't give us the same anxiety, because our anxiety in the book has been, where's Gandalf? What happened to Gandalf? Why isn't he here? And you can do that in the book because later you will have all the time you want to explain all this. And you will be able to say, okay, Gandalf is going to tell his story now. And Gandalf is like, okay, here's what happened. I was called to Saruman's office and the boss put me in jail. So, and explain all the stuff around that. You can do that in the book because in the book there's no rush. You savor the book. You read the book. This is also very Tolkienian because Tolkien in his story very rarely will switch back and forth between two different storylines at one time. Famously, he does this a lot less often than other authors because especially once you get to the Two Towers and the Return of the King, you have whole long stretches where you hear nothing about Frodo and Sam. And then you get whole long stretches where you get nothing but Frodo and Sam. And the fastest that we ever get is when we switch kind of between Merry's perspective and Pippin's perspective. That's the fastest this ever goes. And even that's like a whole chapter or two at a time that you're focusing on one or the other. Or then you get, Merry and Pippin themselves versus Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli. You get whole chapters of this kind of stuff. But you never get, things where in the middle of a chapter you'll switch from one perspective to another, ever. And very rarely will it even go one chapter to the next you switch. It's usually like a couple chapters. And the main action, of course, you never get, because the main action being Frodo and Sam, you get whole sections. The Lord of the Rings is divided into 6 books, right? Books 4 and 6 are all about Frodo and Sam. And books 3 and 5 are all not about Frodo and Sam. And there's a number of reasons why Tolkien does this. And one of those reasons is very well exemplified by the Black Gate scene. Because by the time in the book we get to the Black Gate, we know nothing of Frodo's fate. We only know that he was stung by the spider and then taken prisoner. And so when we get to the Black Gate and we see these things along with everybody else for the first time, we're like... And you can't do that if you're switching back and forth, back and forth, back and forth at a rapid-fire pace, because you just, you ruin the suspense of that moment. Tolkien deliberately avoids telling us a lot of stuff so that we have that level of suspense along with the other characters. We hear about Merry and Pippin wondering what's wrong with what's up with Frodo, whether he's okay, worrying about him. And we're in the same position because we also don't know if Frodo or Sam have been killed yet. We don't know. In the book, it's very different than in the movie. In the movie, we get a rapid fire back and forth very regularly, so we know at all times everybody is fine, more or less, except for crisis points where it's like, are they going to make it? And so this is the same kind of thing in this instance, because Gandalf disappearing in the book is told in the same way. We get a long stretch where all we know is that he's disappeared, and his storyline we have to catch up on later. And this is Tolkien's way of telling his story. He just, and a lot of people don't do that in books, but Tolkien does, and he does it for a very specific purpose, and it works. But it also just does not work in a movie setting. You cannot have a huge long stretch where you then have to catch up on something at the very end. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't have chosen to do something like a book 3 and book 4 division in the movie. You probably could, but you can't do something like Gandalf's disappearance in the same way, because then you have to have him tell a story in retrospect, which, we don't have to have that done for us in the book 3 versus book 4. If we did all of book 3 and saw Merry and Pippin and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, all their stuff, and then we saw Frodo and Sam's, we wouldn't be giving a flashback and explaining stuff. That's not an exposition dump. We're just seeing two different stories told at different times. We can't do that with Gandalf, though, because Gandalf will have to be telling his story of this is what happened. And that just does not work very well in a movie. So the purposes of the way these are handled is different from one to the other, because the medium kind of demands it to a certain extent. The movie demands that we know a little bit more up front so that we don't have to wait until Frodo wakes up and then get an exposition dump from Gandalf, which slows down the action and delays us finding out what's going to happen next. We need these little interspersed things to keep us from having to have that exposition dump. And so to resolve the problem of, but then what do we do with the anxiety of what's wrong with Gandalf, what's up with him, we get the alternative resolution of we don't know how he's going to get out. And we only find out that he gets out when we actually see him in Rivendell. Whereas, of course, in the book, we kind of have a suspicion that he's out by the time we get to Weathertop, but then we have another anxiety of he could still get killed by the Black Riders. So this is, I think, a very useful compare-contrast for this reason, right? Some of the changes that Peter Jackson makes I have criticisms of. Some of them I even like occasionally. But this is one where it's legitimately mainly just a matter of how you have to tell a story in a different medium. And in this particular instance, I think it was done well, because you do kind of need something to keep you hanging on to that other thread. But you also have to find a way to maintain some level of anxiety about it, because otherwise, you're not getting a tension that gets resolved, which is kind of the point of storytelling in the first place. It's like storytelling with no tension and no resolution is not very satisfying storytelling. And of course, all of The Lord of the Rings is a big, giant mess of tensions that have to get resolved, because it's a quest, and it's a dangerous quest, and all this other stuff. So if we're going to have this kind of tension and resolution, you have to figure out how you can do that without, like I say, having to go kind of a backtrack long exposition dump, but still maintain a tension that gets resolved. So the tension gets changed so that we can still have a tension and a different kind of resolution when Frodo wakes up in Rivendell. So that's why I thought this was a really interesting compare and contrast, because it's not so much about the change in the story itself. It's about how the story is handled for the purposes of making the story work in the medium in which it's being told. And I think that's valuable to look at. And it's worth keeping in mind anytime we, have an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, because the adaptation to a certain extent is going to dictate how you tell the story. And sometimes that means changes have to be made. So not all changes are bad. Some of them, you may not like the way the story is told as much in one medium or another. And that's why, generally speaking, people like the book more than the movie in any instance, because the book that tells the original story tells it the way it tells it for a reason. But then you have to modify that for the movie. It wasn't made to be a movie, and so it doesn't quite fit as a movie. But that doesn't mean the changes are just like, oh, that's sloppy, or that's just bad, or why did he do that? No, it's a legitimate change. It may just not be exactly what you would want because you're already dealing with the imperfections of translating a giant, book, the length of the Lord of the Rings, into movie form, which is necessarily shorter and just tells stories differently. Hope that was an interesting look at how these kinds of changes work and why we should keep our minds on, things like, the storytelling medium and how that affects how you have to tell the story and all that kind of stuff. And it was also kind of a nice difference in terms of the usual book versus movie stuff, where I'm normally talking about substantive changes versus, a very different kind of change in this instance. If you did enjoy the video, of course, give it a thumbs up, share it around. Make sure you subscribe if you want to catch my future content. If you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Check the description below for support and social links. Don't forget, on the platform formerly known as Twitter, I drop Tolkien-related trivia questions on a regular basis. And, of course, you can still get a cool Tolkien calendar, which I will link in the description below as well. And there's a discount code for my viewers as well. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Paul Leone, Nathan Dufour, and Robert Kindling.